All right, so former president of this country has been sentenced to 15 months behind bars. The Constitutional Court has found former President Jacob Zuma guilty of contempt of court. Judge Sisi Khampede delivered the judgment that was scathing of his conduct, saying that, the judgment by the majority of judges today sealed his fate, saying that he was undermining the courts, undermining the judiciary, and all this while being in contempt of court. Let's look at some democratic implications here, some political implications, and we're joined by analyst Angelo Fick, and it's always a great pleasure to have you with us, Angelo. Starting with, people have been debating forever. He's faced corruption charges forever. Many have asked if and when the former president could and would go to court. That was for big charges. Now he's going to jail for contempt of court. Did you see this coming? Angelo, we're not getting your sound. I'm not sure if you have muted yourself or if we're having a technical problem. Let's see if we can try.
Right, so as I just said, I would not have foreseen this in December of 2020. At the time, we were in the middle of our second wave build-up in the pandemic, and one wouldn't have thought that the belligerence and the nose-thumbing that Mr. Zuma has performed in relation to the court processes would have gone quite as far as they did. And given the length of time that has passed between the first institution of the charges of corruption and his finally now appearing in court on them, one would have thought he'd play for the same kind of time in his relationship with the Constitutional Court. But that has clearly not been the case. The justices and associate justices of South Africa's Apex Court sounding quite impatient and quite exasperated with him. And we must also remember Toby's arguments before that court about a month ago, in which he outlined the very specific urgent reasons why this court couldn't delay the findings any further.
So the court pointed out today that he's often spoken about going to prison himself. Some would say that Zuma made a political calculation. Either the courts would not find against him, or he would delay, or he would go to jail, but that could galvanize his supporters. Could the courts be making a martyr here?
I'm not certain that the courts are necessarily making a martyr out of Mr. Zuma. Mr. Zuma may very well turn himself into a martyr, and many of his supporters may see him as such. This is a country with a very specific architecture founded on its constitution as both foundational law and supreme law. And the separation of three spheres of government is one that must be observed and has continually been returned under the sixth administration as the primary function of these kinds of decisions. So the separation between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive is one that I think under Mr. Zuma's presidency of the country was often in question. That being said, it's not clear, because the minority judgment does make mention of this, that there weren't other routes available to the Commission of Inquiry, but they did indicate that they found the State Capture Commission of Inquiry's engagement with Mr. Zuma far too deferential. And I think that this is a lesson that all South Africans have to take into account. However powerful you may imagine yourself to be, you still have to articulate that power inside the constitutional framework of the Republic of South Africa. And Mr. Zuma may have miscalculated somewhat in thinking that the political discourse and the rhetoric that he was engaging in the last 6 months would override and somehow sway the judicial rhetoric on which the country is founded both in letter and in form. And this judgment affirms that this is a country not of rhetoric and politics only, but also of judicial principle. And that judicial principle is what is now going to be tested for all 60 million South Africans, all its institutions, all its organizations, both political and non-political, about whether or not they respect the judgment, whether they imagine that the judgment itself is somehow unfair, not because of the principles on which the judgment was made, but because of the outcome.
Well, the court itself laid out those stakes today. Let's just look at some of the things it said, that it is the lofty and lonely work of the judiciary to uphold the Constitution at any and all cost. And the judge spoke about how this conduct by Zuma could encourage others to defy court orders. And then the crux of it was that the judiciary relies on its moral authority. So basically saying if nobody believes in the judiciary, the cops won't go out and effect arrests and march people to jail. The judgments could be ignored. And how far-fetched is that? I mean, this has happened in some countries, hasn't it?
Yes, and it's not at all far-fetched because this is a country that is ostensibly a democracy, and therefore it should have equal opportunity and equal chance and equal administration and fair administration of the rule of law. And so somebody appearing in a magistrate's court on a papgeld charge or somebody appearing in a high court can now, if Mr. Zuma was allowed to get away with thumbing his nose at the courts and refusing to submit himself to the rule of law, if he's allowed to do it, then any of the people in magistrates and high courts can also just walk away from processes and impugn the judges at will in public fora and simply refuse to submit themselves to what the law requires of them. But it's more egregious, as the judgment pointed out, than simply that, because Mr. Zuma himself took the oath of office twice as President of the Republic of South Africa to obey and uphold the Constitution. And this, I think, is a lesson that all the members of Parliament, all the elected officials across all three spheres of government, or three tiers of government, will have to bear in mind, because we have had members of Parliament misunderstand the Constitution and misread the Constitution as recently as in the last 3 days when it comes to why and when we need local government elections. And this judgment reminds us that actually when you take that oath of office, you should take it seriously. And therefore upholding the Constitution and protecting it requires of you not to go around undoing the value of the institutions of that structure that are structured by that Constitution. Because Mr. Zuma did have other opportunities and options available to him. Again, he could have gone the legal challenge route, long and unpleasant as it may have been, instead of these extrajudicial processes in which he's engaged of writing open letters to the public, of making statements in the public domain, rather than engaging the court. He did not make representations in this particular matter to the Constitutional Court itself. And that, I think, speaks to contempt for the judicial process rather than just a judgment that it may be unfair, because everybody is open to judging the judicial process they've been submitted to as unfair. But the challenge to that judicial system must happen through the judicial channels, not by extramural and extrajudicial processes, because that is to change us into a country that is not governed by the rule of law, but by the rule of ego and the rule of will. And that is not where we want to go back to. We've lived there before.
Angelo, we're running out of time, but I'd like to quickly get your response to some of the responses today from his supporters. Mzwanele Manye from the Jacob Zuma Foundation saying the judges picked the sweeter side, the side that was sweeter. This is because the judgment was not unanimous. So I guess could it give some of his supporters ammunition to say that there were some judges that were going to be leaner? Then the MKMVA, Carl Niehaus, saying there's a dictatorship of the judiciary, it's treacherous, and the whole state capture commission, he reiterated, was created to target Zuma. So despite this incredible judgment indicting somebody about speaking because they spoke against the court, the rhetoric around the former president seems to remain pretty much the same. Do you agree?
I think these are people who are either deliberately or unfortunately accidentally, out of either ignorance or some other form of lack of knowledge, misreading what a minority judgment is. The minority judgment did not find that the president was being unfairly treated. In fact, it questioned principles of law and the consequences of the decision. But in the large, it agreed that the former president, had acted inappropriately and should be sanctioned. And therefore, I think people are merely using this as a political opportunity, but they're going to run out of gas, and sooner rather than later.
All right, we have to leave it there, but thank you for your analysis as always, Angelo Fick, joining us there.